Listen carefully. This story was never meant to survive. It was buried on purpose under ledgers, laws, and the polite lies of men in power. If you feel uneasy in the next few seconds, that's your instincts waking up. Because what you're about to hear exposes a dangerous truth. History doesn't belong to the educated. It belongs to the obedient. In the summer of 1822, death crept up the Mississippi River disguised as commerce. Cotton, whiskey, silverware, and something else. Something invisible. By the time the first man collapsed on the docks of Natchez, the city was already infected. Yellow fever didn't knock. It didn't negotiate. It burned through blood, turned eyes yellow, organs black, and proud families into funeral processions in a matter of days. Doctors called it miasma, bad air, God's will, anything except what it really was, a system failure. Natchez was rich, obscenely rich, marble columns, crystal chandeliers, a city built on forced labor and unquestioned authority. And when the fever hit, the men in charge responded the only way they knew how, by doubling down on tradition. They cut veins and drained blood. They forced mercury down throats until mouths ulcerated and minds broke. Patients didn't just die, they were dismantled. And while educated men argued over textbooks written a century earlier, something unthinkable was happening 10 miles away on a plantation no one cared to name. An enslaved man, illiterate by law, invisible by design, was watching people survive. Not miraculously, not randomly, consistently. He had no degree, no license, no permission to know what he knew. But bodies responded to his methods. Fevers broke, vomiting stopped. Men who were supposed to be dead stood back up. And every recovery was an accusation. Not just against the doctors, but against the entire hierarchy that said knowledge only flowed downward. Here's the part history tries to suffocate. The cure was already there. It existed long before white coats and Latin terminology. It traveled across oceans in memory, not books. Passed through whispers, not lectures. And when it surfaced in Natchez, it threatened more than medical pride. It threatened control. Because if an enslaved man could save lives while professors failed, then the lie at the center of the system collapsed. This isn't just a story about a fever. It's about what happens when truth appears in the wrong hands, and why those hands are punished for it. The man's name was Jonas Ryder, but names like his were never meant to last. They weren't carved into stone or printed in books. They were spoken quietly, passed mouth to ear, then erased. Jonas was property, bought young, worked hard, forgotten by design, and yet inside that system he carried something more dangerous than rebellion. He carried memory. Jonas had learned early that survival wasn't about strength. It was about attention, watching who lived, watching who didn't, remembering what helped and what harmed. On the plantation, sickness was constant, infected wounds, fevers, stomach rot. The white doctors came occasionally, always with the same tools and the same confidence, and the same results. Jonas noticed that when they left, death often followed faster. But there were others, older men, older women, people whose knowledge wasn't written, but lived. They knew which bark cooled fire in the blood, which roots stopped the body from bleeding itself out, which leaves calmed vomiting. This knowledge wasn't mystical, it was empirical, tested over generations, refined by necessity, and it terrified the system because it worked without permission. One woman changed everything for Jonas. She had crossed oceans and survived revolutions. She had lived through multiple fever seasons and watched entire villages disappear. When she spoke, she didn't explain, she instructed. Exact temperatures, exact timing, no guessing, no ritual, just precision. She told him something that would later echo in his mind as bodies piled up in Natchez. The doctors kill more than the fever. That sentence is lethal to authority. When she died, she left Jonas what she could. A small pouch of dried bark and seeds, and something far more dangerous, responsibility. Knowledge becomes a burden the moment you understand the cost of not using it. So when the fever finally reached the plantation, Jonas watched the pattern repeat. Blood drained from men already weak. Mercury burned through bodies that needed rest. The treatments were worse than the disease, and Jonas understood something the doctors couldn't allow themselves to see. Expertise can become a prison. When your identity depends on being right, evidence becomes your enemy. Jonas didn't announce himself. He didn't challenge anyone openly. That would have been suicide. He moved at night, treated quietly, adjusted doses, observed results. And the results were undeniable. Men lived, consistently. Here's the truth that history whispers but never shouts. Systems don't collapse because they're attacked. They collapse because they're exposed. And Jonas Ryder was about to expose one, using nothing but bitter bark, disciplined observation, and the courage to act without permission. The city hadn't noticed yet, but it would. Natchez didn't panic at first. Panic would have meant admitting weakness. Instead, the city performed confidence. Bells rang, doctors made rounds, notices were posted telling citizens to trust the process, and people did, right up until the process buried their children. By the end of June, death had crossed the invisible border between the docks and the mansions. When judges' daughters began vomiting black, faith in authority cracked. The same men who had laughed at the river districts now locked their doors and burned sulfur in their hallways like medieval peasants. Education didn't save them. Status didn't save them. Obedience didn't save them. What saved them, when they survived at all, was intervention that came from below. Jonas entered the city the way truth usually does, quietly, inconveniently, and through servants' doors. He wasn't invited by the medical board. He was summoned by desperation. A carpenter here, a cook there, skilled enslaved people whose owners couldn't afford to lose them. The pattern repeated itself. Doctor arrives, blood is drawn, mercury is administered, patient worsens, family prays. Then someone whispers Jonas's name, and the fever breaks. This is where the story turns dangerous. Because coincidence can be dismissed, patterns cannot. Patients treated by the city's finest physicians were dying at terrifying rates. Patients touched by Jonas's methods, directly or through those he trained, were surviving. Not all, but enough to make denial impossible. Survival itself became evidence, and evidence, when it contradicts authority, is treated as heresy. The medical board didn't investigate. They didn't observe. They didn't ask questions. They reacted the way threatened institutions always do, by protecting the hierarchy instead of the people. They said Jonas was reckless, untrained, dangerous. They said his successes were luck, placebo, statistical noise. Notice what they didn't say. They didn't say he was wrong, because deep down, they knew. The older doctors had bled patients for decades. They had watched men weaken under their care and called it science. To admit Jonas was right would mean admitting they had been killing people, not out of malice, but out of obedience to outdated knowledge. And that kind of guilt destroys reputations, legacies, and self-image. So they chose pride. Behind closed doors, they petitioned the city council to stop him. Not to test his methods, not to regulate them, to silence him, to put the knowledge back in the shadows where it belonged. This is the mechanism you must understand. When truth threatens status, status will always call truth dangerous. Jonas was no longer just treating a fever. He was challenging who was allowed to know, and for that, power was preparing to crush him. The order came quietly, not as a public arrest, not as a dramatic confrontation. Power rarely moves loudly when it knows it's wrong. Instead, the city council issued a health protection directive. A clean phrase, a moral disguise. It declared that only licensed physicians were permitted to administer treatment within city limits. Anyone else would be charged with endangering public safety. Public safety. While the graves were still fresh, Jonas heard about the directive before it reached the streets. Warnings traveled faster than laws when people trusted you. He understood immediately what it meant. This wasn't about medicine, it was about containment. Not of disease, but of knowledge. For a moment he considered stopping. He knew the cost of defiance. He had seen men disappear for less. But then he saw the bodies lined up behind a church on High Street. He saw children wrapped in sheets because coffins had run out. And he realized something that would define the rest of his life. When a system is already killing you, obedience is not safety. So he continued. But he adapted. He taught instead of treating, showed others how to prepare the bark infusion, how to cool the body without draining it, how to let the fever burn without feeding it poison. He spoke in fragments, never the full method at once. Knowledge, like contraband, had to be distributed in pieces. The city responded the way empires always do when control slips. They escalated. Rumors appeared overnight that Jonas's remedies caused infertility, that survivors would later go mad, that African methods were cursed. Ministers warned congregations that accepting help from him was inviting spiritual corruption. Fear is cheaper than evidence and far more effective. Then came the warning meant just for him. 2 men, clean coats, polite voices. They told him to leave the city, framed it as mercy, said the council didn't want trouble. Jonas listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that men in power reveal everything when they think you are beneath them. When they finished, he asked one question. How many survived under your care last week? They didn't answer, because numbers don't respect titles. That night, Jonas treated a woman the doctors had already abandoned. Her husband had been told to prepare for death. By morning, her fever broke. By evening, she was sitting up. Word spread faster than any decree. You can outlaw a person, you can't outlaw results. And that's when power made its final calculation. If Jonas lived, the hierarchy would bleed out. So they chose a different cure, one designed not to heal, but to erase. They didn't arrest Jonas in daylight. That would have drawn questions, witnesses, doubt. Instead, they waited until the city was quiet and fear had settled into people's bones. Just before dawn, when sickness feels strongest and hope is weakest, they took him. No charges were read, no explanation offered. He was moved like a contagion, not a man. Hands bound, head lowered, taken through streets he had saved. By noon, the story had already been written for him. The council announced that an unlicensed individual had been detained for spreading unsafe medical practices. They said he had endangered lives. They said he exploited desperation. They said decisive action had been taken to restore order. Order, while the fever still burned. Here's what history rarely tells you. Silencing truth doesn't require proving it wrong. It only requires removing the messenger long enough for exhaustion to do the rest. People get tired. Grief dulls curiosity. Survival replaces justice. Power counts on this. Jonas was held in a small brick structure behind the city jail, far from the main cells, far from public view. No trial date was set, no lawyer allowed. The doctors visited once, not to question him, but to document him, to reduce him to notes, height, age, disposition. They were studying him the way they studied disease. He told them nothing new, he didn't need to, because the knowledge was already loose. That's the mistake they made. They believed information lived in books, licenses, institutions. They couldn't imagine it living in people, in hands, in memory. While Jonas sat in that cell, his methods continued spreading through kitchens, back rooms, servant quarters, modified, simplified, adapted. Each person added what they knew, knowledge evolving in real time, something rigid systems cannot do, and the results continued. Death rates quietly dropped in certain neighborhoods, not the wealthy ones, not the official ones, the invisible ones, the places no reports bothered to track. But people noticed, especially the doctors, because now they had a problem worse than Jonas. They had contradiction. They could no longer claim ignorance. They could no longer pretend the fever was unstoppable. And that meant their past decisions, the bleeding, the mercury, the arrogance, were no longer tragic mistakes. They were choices. So the narrative shifted. The council released a statement praising recent improvements in outcomes, crediting stricter enforcement of medical authority. They never mentioned Jonas. They never mentioned the methods. History, after all, is written by those who control the paperwork. A week later, Jonas was gone. No record of transfer, no death certificate, no burial site, just absence. And absence is the cleanest form of censorship. But here's the flaw in erasure. When you remove a man without removing what he changed, You create a ghost that never stops speaking. The fever would return to Natchez again, and next time people would remember. Years later, when the fever came back as it always did, something subtle had shifted. The city still pretended it hadn't learned anything. Official treatments remained the same. Bloodletting, mercury, authority in a white coat. On paper, nothing had changed, but in practice, everything had. People waited. They delayed calling doctors. They watched. They listened. They tried other methods first. Quiet methods. Methods that didn't carry names or licenses, and when those methods worked, they didn't celebrate publicly. They remembered privately. Survival became an act of quiet rebellion. This is how suppressed knowledge actually survives, not through monuments or recognition, but through behavior, through what people do when no one is watching. Older residents began telling newcomers strange advice. Don't weaken the body when it's already fighting. Don't trust treatments that look violent. Cool the fever. Don't drain the life. They never said where the knowledge came from. They didn't need to. Saying too much would have invited correction, and correction was just another word for punishment. Official records from later outbreaks show something strange. Doctors couldn't explain it. Mortality rates varied wildly between neighborhoods with similar conditions. Same weather, same water, same disease, but different outcomes. The reports blamed unknown factors, cultural habits, luck. They never considered resistance, because to consider resistance, they would have had to accept that people were choosing not to obey them. Here's the deeper truth. Jonas didn't just save lives. He changed the relationship between authority and survival. He taught people, without ever saying it, that expertise is not the same as truth, that credentials do not guarantee care, that systems optimize for stability, not for you, and once that idea takes root, it never fully dies. Medical institutions eventually evolved. Bloodletting faded. Mercury disappeared. New theories emerged. Germ theory arrived and rewrote everything. Textbooks changed. Professors congratulated themselves on progress. But they skipped a chapter. They never asked why people had stopped trusting them long before the science caught up. They never asked how uneducated communities had learned empirically what institutions took decades to admit. They never asked who paid the price for that delay, because asking would have exposed something unforgivable. Progress didn't come from authority being right. It came from authority being bypassed, and that pattern, once you see it, appears everywhere. In economics, in politics, in education, in every system where knowledge flows downward and obedience flows upward. Innovation is tolerated only when it can be claimed. Until then, it's called dangerous. Jonas Ryder never appears in textbooks, but his shadow does. In every moment where people trust lived results over official permission. That's not folklore, that's a warning. Because the same mechanism that erased him is still operating today, just with better language, cleaner paperwork, and far more convincing smiles. And once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. Here's where the story stops being about the past and starts pointing directly at you. Because the system that erased Jonas didn't disappear. It refined itself. It learned that brute force creates martyrs, but bureaucracy creates silence. Today, truth isn't dragged into cells. It's buried under policies, peer review, compliance rules, and best practices. Cleaner, polite, invisible. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. How many ideas are dismissed not because they're wrong, but because they come from the wrong place? In Jonas's time, the disqualifier was skin color and bondage. Today, it's credentials, funding, institutional backing, language. If knowledge doesn't arrive wearing the right uniform, it's treated as noise, no matter how well it works. This is the hidden psychology of control. Authority doesn't need to be correct. It only needs to be recognized. Modern systems are built to reward conformity, not curiosity. Professionals are trained inside frameworks that define what questions are acceptable before they ever ask them. Step outside those boundaries, and you don't get debated. You get ignored, discredited, or quietly excluded. No cell required. And just like before, the justification is always safety. Safety from misinformation, safety from panic, safety from people making decisions for themselves. But safety, when defined by institutions, often means predictability, and predictability is control's favorite environment. Look closely at how progress actually happens, not in press conferences, not in official announcements. It happens on the margins, in communities testing what works because they have to, in people comparing results, not titles, in failures that teach more than polished success stories ever could. Then, years later, the institution arrives, names it, standardizes it, and claims ownership. The messy origin is erased. The unauthorized experimenter becomes a footnote or disappears entirely, just like Jonas. This is why the story still matters, because every generation is taught a comforting lie. That truth naturally rises to the top, that good ideas win, that systems self-correct quickly. They don't. They resist, they delay. They punish deviation until the cost of being wrong becomes greater than the cost of admitting it. Jonas forced that cost early, using nothing but results, and that's the part power never forgives. So the next time you're told to trust blindly, to wait patiently, to stop asking inconvenient questions for your own good, remember Natchez. Remember how many had to die before authority loosened its grip. Remember that progress often begins as disobedience. This isn't encouragement to reject expertise. It's a reminder to interrogate it. Because the most dangerous words a system can hear are not, "You're evil." There's a final layer to this story that most people miss, because it's the one that makes us uncomfortable. Jonas wasn't erased just because he challenged medicine. He was erased because he proved something far more threatening. Ordinary people can learn to protect themselves without permission. That idea is radioactive to any centralized system. If people realize they can observe, test, adapt, and share knowledge horizontally, peer to peer, then power loses its monopoly. Fear stops working the same way. Dependence weakens, and control becomes expensive. So systems don't just suppress truth, they train people to doubt their own judgment. Think about how often you've been told, "You're not qualified to understand this. Leave it to the experts. It's too complex for the public." Those phrases sound reasonable, responsible even, but they carry a hidden message. Your lived experience is inferior to sanctioned interpretation. Jonas's crime wasn't healing bodies, it was validating intuition with results. He showed that careful observation, done by people who actually suffer the consequences, can outperform distant authority. And once people experience that for themselves, trust is never the same again. That's why his story had to fade into myth. Because myths feel safe. Myths don't demand action. History does. Somewhere along the way, we were taught that progress is a straight line guided by enlightened leaders. But the truth is messier and far more human. Progress usually starts with someone ignored, mocked, or punished for stepping outside the approved path. Only later do institutions clean it up and pretend it was inevitable. Jonas was never meant to be remembered as a man. He was meant to be a warning example. This is what happens when you overstep your place. But the lesson flipped, quietly, permanently. The real inheritance he left behind wasn't a remedy, it was a posture toward power. Watch closely, measure outcomes, share what works, and never confuse authority with truth. That posture still scares systems today, because once people stop surrendering their agency, no amount of paperwork can put it back. So when you hear stories like this and feel that low, uneasy hum in your chest, that's not fear, that's recognition, a reminder that you come from a long line of people who survived not because they obeyed perfectly, but because they paid attention. By the time Natchez finally learned how yellow fever truly spread, by the time textbooks were rewritten and old treatments quietly labeled primitive, no one went looking for Jonas Ryder. There was nothing to find. No grave, no plaque, no apology etched into marble. Just cleaner theories and confident lectures delivered as if progress had arrived on schedule, guided by wisdom instead of resistance. That's how endings usually work in official history. The suffering is minimized, the disruptor is erased. The system congratulates itself for eventually stopping the harm it once defended. But the real ending of this story didn't happen in a council chamber or a medical journal. It happened in kitchens, in back rooms, in whispered instructions passed during the next outbreak and the one after that. Jonas didn't survive in records. He survived in behavior. People learned to pause before surrendering their bodies to authority. They learned to ask quiet questions, to compare outcomes, to trust patterns they could see with their own eyes. And once that learning spread, it could never be fully undone. That's the ending power fears most. Because erasing a man is easy. Erasing a lesson is almost impossible. Somewhere, generations later, a family chose rest instead of bleeding, cooling instead of poisoning, observation instead of obedience. They didn't know Jonas's name. They didn't need to. His influence lived in the decision itself. And that's how suppressed truth actually wins, not by overthrowing systems overnight, but by outlasting them. So if this story feels uncomfortably familiar, that's because it isn't finished. The names change, the uniforms change, the language gets smoother, but the pattern remains. Authority resists what it can't control. Truth appears where permission is absent, and progress is delayed until disobedience becomes unavoidable. Jonas Ryder never got justice, but he got something rarer. He proved that even inside the most brutal systems, truth can move sideways, quietly, patiently, from one human being to another, long after the men who silenced him were buried, long after their certainty rotted away.